Robert Christian Hansen was a serial killer who committed a series of murders in the northwestern United States. He usually targeted teenagers, sex workers, and strippers, and his methods of murder were extremely brutal. First, he would kidnap his victims by luring them, then take them to a remote valley in a small airplane. When the victims woke up, he'd tell them they'd be spared if they complied with his sexual fantasies. And then he'd strip them naked and throw them into the forest while he took a shotgun and hunted them like animals. After the killings, he would take the jewelry from his victims as trophies and bury their bodies. Between 1972 and 1983, at least 17 women were killed by him. Because of his profession and his brutal methods, he was known as the Butcher Baker. Hansen was born on February 15, 1939 in Estherville, Iowa. His family immigrated to the U.S. from Denmark. His mother was a housewife, and his father was a baker who supported the family with a bakery. Hansen's father was particularly strict and even a little harsh. For example, Hansen was a natural left-handed person, which didn't affect anything, but his father thought it was serious, so he would force Hansen to eat with his right hand. If he couldn't hold the knife and fork securely, he would be beaten. He was also expected to work long hours in the bakery. If something went wrong, his father would pick up a rolling pin and beat him. Growing up in such a high-pressure family environment, Hansen's personality became very weak, low in self-esteem, and shy. On top of that, he also had a speech impediment called stuttering. Especially after puberty, he had severe acne, so Hansen was often teased at school. In middle school, a lot of people fall in love and date, but he could only watch from the sidelines. He was always quiet with girls, and even when he tried to talk to them, they didn't like him. So it could be that the strong sexual desire of adolescence and his extremely low self-esteem together made Hansen hate all women. Hansen didn't fit in with his classmates in high school. He had a lot of responsibilities at home, including heavy bakery work and different religious beliefs, and he was poor and had low self-esteem. This made it difficult for him to participate in various choirs and sports clubs. He didn't like school and women. The loneliness of the environment made Hansen turn to hunting. It's a solitary pursuit, and he's very talented. After a period of practice, his hunting skills improved very quickly, often catching a lot of prey. Hansen joined the U.S. Army Reserves in 1957 and was discharged after a year. That same year, he had his first sexual experience after being seduced by a sex worker. He was then employed as an assistant instructor for junior police officers at a police academy in Pocahontas, Iowa. He met and married a young woman there. But on December 7, 1960, he was dissatisfied with his high school life and wanted revenge. He threatened another man to join him in setting a fire, and they set the high school bus garage on fire. This not only cost his job and also got him sentenced to 3 years in prison. During his incarceration, his wife opted for a divorce. 20 months later, he was released from prison. Rather than going to work without an income, he turned to burglary to make ends meet. In fact, he was incarcerated several times for burglary during that time because he enjoyed the thrill of it so much. Hansen met his second wife in 1967. This time, he and his wife moved to Anchorage, Alaska, and wanted to start a new life. He had 2 children with his wife and planned to open a bakery. But he didn't have money, so he bought expensive insurance for his family's things and then pretended to be robbed and cheated of the insurance money. Then, he opened a bakery with this money and became a baker. Over the next few years, he bought a small plane, even though he didn't have a pilot's license. Furthermore, his neighbors liked him because he was a skilled hunter. He had broken the local bow hunting record 4 times and had an entire wall in his house filled with trophies from hunting competitions. In December 1971, Hansen was arrested twice. The first time was for attempting to rape a housewife, and the second time was for raping a sex worker. However, the charge was later dropped. It's not clear when Hansen's first murder took place, but police believe it was in 1971. On December 22nd, Celia Van Zanten, who was 18 at the time, and her 2 brothers were watching a movie and smoking marijuana. Celia wants to buy a soda because the marijuana smoke in her room was making her thirsty. She left the house around 8:30 p.m. because the supermarket closed at 9 p.m., but she didn't end up going to the supermarket. It was 2 days later that her brothers reported her missing. Someone saw Celia walking to the supermarket between 8:45 p.m. and 9. Another neighbor said he saw Celia on Northern Lights BLVD around 9 p.m. Her body was found 3 days later near Chugach State Park. The medical examiner said she had frozen to death and had stab wounds to her chest and strangulation marks on her wrists. The police believe that Hansen raped and killed Celia. This happened 3 days after Hansen raped the sex worker, and there's a marker on his airplane map in the area where Celia's body was found, so he's thought to be the killer, but there's no proof linking him to the case. The second was 17-year-old Megan Siobhan Emmerich, who was at boarding school at the time but disappeared after leaving the laundry room of her dormitory. Hansen, who was later considered a suspect in Megan's disappearance, denied. He said he wasn't involved in her disappearance, but the police still think that Megan might have been one of Hansen's victims. Reports say that Hansen told an inmate he'd taken Megan to a cabin in the Seward area and killed and buried her. Mary Kathleen Thill, 22 years old. On July 5, 1975, she was driven to a bakery by a friend. Then she disappeared near a waterfall in Seward between roughly 1:30 p.m. and 2 p.m. Because a marker on Hansen's airplane map was located there, the police thought he might have something to do with Mary's disappearance, but Hansen said he wasn't involved. Hansen was arrested once in 1976, but not for murder. He was charged with burglary for stealing a chainsaw from Fred Meyer's in Anchorage. That's why he didn't commit murder for several years after that. And he was diagnosed with bipolar disorder after taking psychological tests and sentenced to 5 years in prison. He was required to undergo psychiatric treatment, but the Alaska Supreme Court reduced his sentence so that he ultimately served less than 5 years. Eklutna Annie is thought to be the only unidentified victim. Her body was found in Eklutna, Alaska on July 21, 1980. Hansen has confessed to stabbing her to death in the back after she tried to flee his vehicle. It's unclear whether she was a prostitute or not, and although Hansen said she might have been from Kodiak, others thought she was from California. She was identified as having European ancestry, but she might also have had Native American ancestry. Investigators and forensic scientists are still trying to identify her using updated facial reconstruction and genetic methods. Joanne Messina was a 24-year-old stripper who went missing on May 19, 1980 in Seward, Alaska. According to Hansen's confession, he and Joanne went out to dinner, during which Joanne offered to trade sex for money. He then drove Joanne and her dog to a remote location and shot her twice with a .22 caliber revolver, as well as her dog once. Then he dumped Joanne's body in a gravel pit and poured gravel over it. Her badly decomposed body was discovered on July 8, 1980, after it had been destroyed by wildlife. Roxanne Eastland was a 24-year-old woman who went from missing on June 28, 1980, in Anchorage, Alaska. At the time, she was staying at the Economy Inn on Spenard Road. She'd been with her boyfriend for the past 2 weeks. On the day she disappeared, she met a known man on 4th Avenue downtown. Since then, no one has seen or heard from her. Hansen admitted to killing her, but her body was never found. Lisa Futrell was a 41-year-old stripper who worked at an Anchorage nightclub. On September 6, 1980, she met Hansen at work and was abducted. On September 7th, Lisa didn't come home from her shift, as 2 of Lisa's young roommates noticed she was missing and reported her to the police. According to Hansen's later confession, he killed Lisa, and her body was eventually recovered on May 9, 1984. Sherry Morrow, 23 years old, was a stripper. On November 17, 1981, she told a friend that she was going to meet a photographer who promised to pay her $300 for nude photographs. After that, she disappeared. On September 12, 1982, a hunter found a shallow grave on the banks of the Nick River, from which Sherry's remains were identified. The medical examiner determined that she'd received 3 gunshot wounds to the back, and bullets found near the body indicated that a 223er Mini-14 shotgun had been used to fire the bullets. Interestingly, the body was found fully clothed and with no bullet holes in her clothes, meaning Sherry was naked at the time of the shooting and someone helped her get dread death. Andrea Mona Altieri, a 24-year-old stripper, took a cab to the Boniface Mall in Anchorage, Alaska, at 11 p.m. on December 2, 1981, where she was staying. She planned to meet an unknown male to take photographs and perform exotic dances, after which she disappeared. Her body was never found. It was only when the police searched Hansen's house and found several of Altieri's possessions that they connected her to Hansen's murder. Hansen's confession states that he met Altieri, threatened her with a gun, and then took her to a road off the Palmer Highway, where he sexually abused her. When she resisted, she killed her with a .22 Browning automatic pistol. He then took Altieri's necklace and threw her off a bridge into the river. Sue Luna, a 23-year-old exotic dancer, agreed to a $300 photo shoot with a nightclub patron on May 26, 1982, in the parking lot of a restaurant in Anchorage, Alaska. She was reported missing the next day, and her remains were found on April 24, 1984. Hansen confessed that he kidnapped and killed her, then buried her near the Nick River. He said that he made her flee naked into the forest and hunted her like an animal. Robin Pelkey, who lived in Anchorage, Alaska in the early 1980s, was originally an unidentified victim as well. However, as recently as October 2021, she was identified through the help of forensic genealogy. Before that, she was known as Horseshoe Harriet. That was because her body was found in that place on April 25, 1984. Delynn Renee Frey, 22 years old, who disappeared around March 1983, was known as Jane Doe, when her body was found and was buried in the Anchorage Cemetery until 1989, when a police officer recognized her jewelry in a case file photo. Paula Goulding, who was 30 years old at the time, was a dancer. She was abducted on April 25, 1983. Her body was found on September 2, 1983, near the Nick River. She had a gunshot wound to the back, but her clothes were undamaged. Hansen later confessed that he took Goulding to his plane. When they arrived at a remote location, she tried to resist and escape before Hansen killed her with a rifle. Malaya Larson was a 28-year-old dancer who went missing near Anchorage, Alaska, on July 10, 1981. Her body was found in a parking lot on April 24, 1984. Teresa Watson, a 22-year-old dancer, told her roommate on March 25, 1983, that she was going to meet a man who would pay her $300 for her services, and her body was found on April 26, 1984. Hansen later confessed to the crime. He kidnapped and killed her in Scenic Lake. Because the soil was frozen, he couldn't bury her, so he dumped her body near the lake. Angela Lynn Fettern, 24 years old, she was a dancer, went missing in February 1983 near 4th Avenue in Anchorage, Alaska, but her boss didn't report her disappearance to the police until May. Her body was found near Figure 8 Lake on April 26, 1984. Later, Hansen confessed to kidnapping and murdering her. Tamara Pedersen, 20 years old, she was a nightclub dancer, called her family on August 7, 1982, to tell them that someone had paid her to go on a photo shoot. In reality, she had been kidnapped and murdered by Hansen. Her body was not found until Hansen marked the location on a map. The incident that prompted Hansen to launch an investigation and make an arrest occurred on June 13, 1983. It involved 17-year-old Cindy Paulson. At the time, Hansen offered Cindy $200 for sexual services. When she got into his car, he took out a gun and forced her into the basement of his home. There, he chained her to a post and repeatedly tortured and raped her. Afterwards, he took her to his private airport where he was going to take her to a cabin in a very remote valley, a place that could only be reached by boat or airplane. While Hansen was getting the plane ready to take off, Cindy jumped out of the back seat of the car and then ran toward nearby 6th Avenue. Hansen was really scared and tried to catch her, but a truck passed by at that exact moment. Cindy stopped the truck, and the driver got out of the car and saw the bruises on her body. He realized the situation was serious and took her to the nearest motel, Mush Inn. The staff there helped Cindy call her boyfriend, and the truck driver reported the incident to the police. The police then took Cindy to the station, where she described the details of the perpetrator. They questioned Hansen, who said Cindy was a sex worker trying to blackmail him. This was an excuse Hansen had used before. Then, the police didn't consider him a serious suspect because of his demeanor, his job as a baker, and the alibi of one of his friends, John Henning. Although Hansen was not arrested, the police were still trying to find some information about him, because they'd found the bodies of Eklutna Annie, Joanna Messina, and Sherry Morrow in and around Anchorage. One of the detectives thought that all three women had been murdered by the same person. During the investigation, he thought that the killer might be an experienced hunter with low self-esteem and a history of being rejected by women. He also thinks the killer might have a language barrier, and it just so happens that Hansen is one of the local men who fits these descriptions, especially since he also owns a small airplane that would allow him to complete the steps of dumping the bodies with great ease. After Cindy gave her testimony and the detective finished his analysis, the police got a warrant to search Hansen's plane, vehicle, and house. On October 27, 1983, investigators found lots of the missing woman's jewelry and a bunch of guns. They also found a .223 caliber Ruger Mini 14 semi-automatic rifle at Hansen's home. There were multiple markers on Hansen's map, and 3 of those matched the locations where the bodies of the 3 victims were found. When he was arrested, He was charged with assault, kidnapping, multiple weapons offenses, burglary, and insurance fraud. The insurance fraud charge was for the same money that Hansen used to open the bakery and buy the small airplane. When he was confronted with the evidence, Hansen initially denied all charges. However, he later confessed to 4 murders that the police had evidence of. He also provided details of other victims in exchange for serving his sentence in federal prison. At his last trial, Hansen was sentenced to 461 years in prison without the possibility of parole. In May 2014, he was transferred to the Anchorage Correctional Center for health reasons. He passed away on August 21, 2014, at the age of 75 at the Alaska Regional Hospital in Anchorage.